Hello, Ignatian family. My name is Tom Sendejas, and I will be presenting on The Revolution Will Be Flat Screened. I'm going to go off screen and narrate. Think of this as more of a podcast with pictures. So I'll be back in just a second. I want to welcome you, and I'm going to invoke the spirit of a movie that is one of the movies I go to when I get too numbed out or my heart has too many barnacles on it of just being exhausted from defense mechanisms against the news of the world, and I need to be refreshed in my spirit. It's the movie Panther Panchali, and what it does for me is it reminds me in its portrayal of a family's resilience and facing poverty in rural India. It certainly touches my spirit and my heart so much. I'm renewed in my hope and my ability to stay fighting for the kingdom of God. And so I offer it in the case that you might find a movie like that, or you have a movie that's like that for you, to bring into the spirit of our discussion today. This quote from Roger Ebert tells us that movies are machines that generate empathy, that we start off in the world maybe somewhat limited by what we might say the prison of ourself, as wonderful as our circumstances might be, and by uh, the aspect of watching a movie, we're taken to, if not knowing what somebody else goes through, at least getting a deep glimpse into it and being moved by it. And that is a noble thing that movies do. If we can see God in all things, then we can see God in movies. A little bit about myself. I've taught courses in theology for many years, including one on film and faith, and have worked in the film industry, used to serve at a video store where it was an industry resource, so I really had to be on top of my game. I majored in film criticism. I write pop culture criticism and film reviews as the couch tamale on Medium. I'm going to start with a brief story to show what film can do. And it's about a movie that came out last year, a short film called Hair Love that won the Oscar for Best Animated Short by Matthew Cherry. And actually, one of our school parents, Karen Tolliver, is a producer on it. And this movie is about a father who is trying to capture his daughter's hair for into a style that she's going to be satisfied with as they embark on a day that is rather momentous for them, as we discover. And it's heartwarming and beautiful. And when I was teaching about it, I just had the idea I was going to teach about self-esteem in communities of color or internalized oppression and all these theories. And when the movie was over, the students really corrected that for me because they immediately wanted to talk about their complicated feelings about their hair. So I teach teenage boys, and they all had, their hair was too curly or too bushy or too not enough or whatever it was, and even how they felt cared for. They remembered being the tenderness of having your hair washed or cut or cared for by your parents, ideally tender experiences. And then that led us to have conversations in which everybody had energy and positive feelings, and we were invested. And now through several minutes of a movie, the energy changed in the room. And we went from their specific story to experiencing universal recognition of our connection. And that's what film can do. We're called to read the signs of the times, and our realities today are many and layered, and it's hard to read them. And a good film or show or music can help us to read them with more acuity and grace. I know we've all had that movie that has stirred your heart and your sense of justice before. And so I really want to call you to think of that and have that accompany you here as well. Filmmaking and TV we're taught to have media literacy. That is wonderful to have all those skills, but I would say we also get the gift of the themes of Catholic social teaching, which you see some of them there. Human dignity, promoting culture of peace, workers' rights, caring for the environment, our home. These are an additional gift that we get to view the experiences that come into our homes. I'm not going to do some of the films that you might expect we would do, like Just Mercy or Romero or Entertaining Angels. I know those films are wonderful. I love them. I'll mention them. But for the sake of time, I think I'm going to do like a deep dive and maybe find some films that perhaps you haven't heard of or don't know. And I hope that this is worth your time for that. Thank you for holding the space for this. We say that we binge watch, but what if we savored? What if we savored the films or media that we consume? And what if it's worth savoring, right? So these are going to be just suggestions. Um, and you can decide if you want to watch with yourself or some friends or a parish event, or maybe have a Justice and Peace movie club. I'll mention some questions to think about. I will speak quickly, so I'm going to pack a lot in. Feel free to use your pause button on this video. I've got some rules here to keep in mind. You may want to pause and look those over. They're just my cautions to you to keep in mind. I want to make sure you do what's best for you or your audience, and not necessarily take in anything here that isn't fitting your boundaries. I'm going to start with a film that is not that well known, I think. At least I don't hear too many people talk about it, but I discovered in 1990. I've used it almost every year since in classes. I'm sorry to say that it's still incredibly relevant about the problems of people being unsheltered and homeless. And it's called God Bless the Child, about a mother and daughter who are displaced and have to go to the streets. They do find some friends that help them navigate the system. We meet a Black family dealing with poverty, and yet generous in their friendship. And we see also others who try to help them. It does lead to some heartbreaking decisions. I will tell you that this is a powerful film. In many ways, it's kind of like it's an illustrated lecture in a TV movie format of the problems of being homeless and how difficult it is to break out of that cycle once you're unsheltered. And you can see some of the things that it addresses. It's almost like a lesson plan that you can click off and have the students apply and say, what did you discover in there? I will say I've seen it, young men, young women, adults. I know when I first saw this, my mom and I were watching it. We both, grabbed each other and hugged and wanted to do more immediately. So be ready. I would pair it with this film, Growing Up Poor in America, where we once again see a lot of single parents and their children, this time dealing with not only poverty, but COVID and how that impacts them. A gut-wrenching scene when the mother goes to pick up a computer for her son from the school, and all the other parents are in cars, and she's just standing there in the rain. Her car is broken down. And this film, which tells us how difficult it is to get Section 8 vouchers and then to use them, because so many communities treat those who are poor or unsheltered as the other and don't want to let them in. This film, Bread and Roses, is a wonderful film about nonviolent activism and labor organizing, and it spells it out in very clear ways to show that the spiritual concept in our social teaching, that we aren't meant just to survive, but to thrive. It's about the Justice for Janitors movement. It's about immigrants who are afraid to stand up for themselves because of the very real consequences that can bring in their lives. It's got George Lopez as a villain. It's got Adrian Brody as the organizer. And you can see here many of the issues that it addresses. I give a little caution that it's got quite a bit of profanity, bilingual profanity. And you'll know your kids who are getting A's in Spanish because they'll laugh at all the jokes. they show us creative nonviolence in many ways and moral situations. There's a scene in the film I must underline, and it's with this great actress Alpidia Carrillo as Rosa, the older sister. You'll recognize this scene when you see it in the film. Students usually ask me to play it again. It's such a game changer in what you're watching in terms of the story, but it also is a great and very, I must admit, very brutally frank explanation of how women in particular have to survive poverty. That same director, Ken Loach, makes a number of socially conscious films, such as I, Daniel Blake, and others that I really recommend to you. I recommend the work of Velcro Ripper, a Canadian filmmaker who does work with documentaries that show us to go beyond the stereotypes of protesters, to see how many of them are so deeply committed and giving their lives to this work, and it's informed by their spirituality. This documentary, The Hunting Ground, about campus sexual assault, I use it with my seniors as they're applying for colleges to have them do a little additional research on how their campus responds to to accusations and events of sexual assault. It's very revealing. And then I use it to ask them to design a nonviolent action that would be effective at reaching their peers on this topic. And I must say, I just saw in the news the other day that a 16-year-old young woman in Chicago, inspired by the movie, is doing exactly that, designing an app and other things to complement the knowledge she got from the film. This is a great short about being a woman in dealing with the men's club, as it were, in the workplace. I want to pair these two films together. It might not seem obvious at first. This is the story, first, of Thomas Young, a soldier who enlisted after 9/11, but was injured shortly thereafter. And the movie is very explicit at showing the high medical situations that he's in, the physical cost that he paid for every day with this, and how he converts to being a peacemaker, and despite his great discomfort and injuries, travels the country promoting a culture of peace. Another war, in a sense, is the war that our DACA recipients, our dreamers, face here in our country. And Moises Serrano is an articulate and very charming young man who goes around the rural South where he's from. He's also queer and talks about that intersectionality and how that adds an additional layer of complication to concerns and anxieties in his own life and his family's life. And in both cases, I would just have you look at something that is true, is that they both risk telling their stories, their authentic, true stories. And if you were to give your witness, what is the true story that you would tell that could possibly impact social change? We see that both of them are charismatic and charming. How does that play into their ability to witness to others? You'll see in Moises's case how, people that you think would not be ready to hear his message and have their arms crossed, by the end they've uncrossed and they're hugging him. This is a movie that I'll mention just as an animated movie, illustrates PTSD using soldiers from Israel and Lebanon. This is kind of complementing Undocumented in the sense that it's a new film coming out about Mexican migrants who fall in love in Mexico and then have to decide at various times whether they're going to cross the border for a different reasons, to escape persecution, to have opportunity, and what that ends up doing to them, how that family separation isn't only right at the border and in those camps. A Force More Powerful is a great series on nonviolence that helps you understand how strategic it is and how many have given their lives to that fight. There's a great segment when people say about nonviolence, well, in World War II, that wouldn't have worked. It's about Norway's nonviolent resistance. This film gets a lot of response from students in my class who sometimes don't identify with the aspects of a course that might have the term social justice in it from their political point of view. But this movie speaks to them about the Immokalee workers who just wanted one more cent for the bushels of tomatoes that they pick. And it shows how they fast and do nonviolent action in trying to gain greater justice for them and their families. In caring for the environment, I like to focus on various elements of creation. And in looking at water, this film has gotten a positive response. It's called Flow for the Love of Water, produced by the late, great Adam Yauch from the Beastie Boys. And it really helps us understand not only the pollution in our water, but who owns our water and who's taking it. Is water going to be the oil of the 21st century? You know, if I can see, that opening of Mad Max Fury Road certainly is like a cinematic parable of power domination related to water. In taking that same element and looking at the climate crisis, those who chase ice in order to document what's happening at our ice caps and the melting of them. And then here are some questions and exercises I do with flow, drinking a glass of water meditatively, thinking about how water is referenced and used as a symbol in the Bible, and then doing actual research on where our water is coming from, who owns it, what's in our water. Moving on to some issues, and to some films that deal with anti-racism, such as Fruitvale Station and the late Oscar Grant, who was killed by police on New Year's Eve in the Bay Area. The movie details his day. Ryan Coogler, Michael B. Jordan partnering up. Melanie Diaz is great in it. And highly recommended film that I pair with The Hate You Give, which is not only about code switching in schools and the difficulty of navigating our different communities and worlds, but also about a police shooting of a young Black person and the awakening of conscience and gaining a voice. I wanted to include this in a discussion of policing because we forget that ICE is a police force, right? And so Living Undocumented is a great, beautifully filmed, addictive reality series that very brave people come forward and tell their stories, and the camera follows them, and we see some shocking things related to ICE. We're lucky to be at a time when Ava DuVernay is making films. Not only is she talented visually, but the subject matter that she takes on, such as in 13th and Middle of Nowhere and Selma, how she shows us that Dr. King, along with Diane Nash and Bayard Rustin and John Lewis and others, really use strategy to develop their nonviolent campaigns. And of course, if you haven't seen When They See Us about the Exonerated Five, I urge you to take this spiritual and powerful mental journey, historical journey that this series will take you on. This brings me to the films of Steve James, who works out of Chicago, the great Hoop Dreams, of course, and this a long but really worthwhile documentary on those people who know the neighborhoods of Chicago, and they can sense or get wind of when violence may be about to occur, and they interrupt it through peacemaking skills. This is about life at a prison, especially how people of color in this prison and how the deck is stacked against them in ways that are really infuriating to witness. The great James Baldwin, I Am Not Your Negro. This is more of a cinematic essay instead of a bio essay or a biography, and well worth your time. He's so prescient in his words. If you're looking for something the whole family can watch that portrays the sharecropping experience and how it kept people in a cycle of poverty, but how they maintain love in their family and resilience, then Sounder is for you. The Craig Kielburger story, It Takes a Child, a Canadian young man who was saddened when he heard of child labor and set out to go investigate it on a fact-finding mission to Pakistan when he's barely out of 8th grade, and then starts an organization that has become a global organization to relieve child labor and deal with its root causes. This has been a powerful film for my students. It generates lots of discussion. It's about messages that men and boys get that cause them to shut down, especially their emotional lives, and the cost that will take, the toll that takes on them. The boys write powerfully about it. Just one little caveat, there's a segment on video games in here, and I don't care how many times I say it, the boys still think this movie tells them they cannot play video games, and they fight against it. And I just have to listen to it because it's not really what the film is saying. These movies about that either are about representation of marginalized communities or actually tell the stories of marginalized communities in ways that we're all the better for. This is about sexual assault in high school, about cover-ups by the town because of the Friday Night Lights mentality, and about, this somebody who, by motivated by conscience, uses her skills to track down the truth about it. If you haven't seen this, it's going to make an impact on you. This movie, I would advise you to make sure you check it out ahead of time because it does involve some stories of self-harm. But Pope Francis tells us that a faith that becomes too rigidly religious and dogmatic may not be able to encounter and welcome as Jesus did. And we are called to do that. And this movie is good for illustrating that. And it elicits many powerful student responses. We're called to collective grief with those who have experienced mass shootings, but it motivates and helps us to recognize gun violence as a peace building and nonviolence issue as well, or that we're called to do that. The stories of Japanese Americans who were interned in the camps portrayed in George Takei's play, resonating with what we know is happening in our signs of the times and tragic realities today, when we know that our Justice Department has, ordered the separation of infants from their breastfeeding mothers. How to Survive a Plague is about how the LGBTQ community and queer activists had to be the ones to respond because the government was not responding to AIDS, and they were losing their friends and loved ones, and they responded through largely protest and an interesting form of like not almost aggressive nonviolent action. There's actions you can debate. There's actions that you will find that you're seeing in protests today that they don't even realize that today's protesters may not realize how they were influenced by ACT UP. And then pair that with a documentary that's coming out soon or just released, Totally Under Control, about the pandemic response today, and have we learned anything from what we've gone through before, and why don't we turn to others to teach us? This is about the great public art memorial project of those who died of AIDS, and many narratives. And it's surprising to find out how many young people today never really know anything about the AIDS quilt or the front responders. This is such a powerful and moving film, and you might want to pair it with Plague, the America Media podcast on the Catholic Church's response to the AIDS crisis. Many people think that the college students or the hippies who protested the war were at odds with the soldiers who were fighting there. And this documentary helps you to realize, sir, no, sir, that much of the anti-war movement was being carried out by soldiers themselves, sometimes within the military or by veterans And it challenges that trope or stereotype that it was privileged hippies versus the soldiers. These movies also complement that. I would point out The Good War is about conscientious objectors during World War II. The Tillman story about how military loss and human loss can be spun for political reasons. Powerful, inspiring movies. These were highly influential on me. Berkeley in the 60s and The War at Home. To think that such young people had to strategize because they were trying to save the lives of those who were being drafted. To look at the Panama deception and enter into discussions of how we've influenced policy or intervened in other countries. Many people are not aware of this particular military action, which resulted in, an invasion really, which lasted in thousands of people dying. And two women journalists were allowed access because I guess the military didn't take them seriously as journalists at the time. And so it's a shocking film. And Roses in December, of course, about Jean Donovan, of course, about the Maryknoll nuns and their great service, where Jean Donovan says, whose heart could be so staunch as to not help these children, not mine, not mine. And yet our own government, and there's footage of this, I think this is very relevant, tried to paint them as subversives in order to discount what was going on. And now I'm going to click through some of these. These are wonderful films that also bring you into knowledge about what went on in Central America, Latin America, related to us, related to their own governments. This film that goes into the story of a man who comes from such a poor background, and he eventually, takes a bus hostage, and people judge just the criminality of the action and not. This film goes into all the contributions that led up to such a thing. More of these films to check out on Central and Latin America and our role there. Of course, the great Father Boyle and the movie G-Dog and Homeboy Industries. I use this sometimes to illustrate the four loves. I use it to talk about the Gospels and saying, this is the kind of community Jesus was asking for, to ask for a dialogue between King's image of beloved community and Boyle's image of radical kinship. And then in the Latin, not far from where Homeboy Industries exists is a neighborhood. The neighborhood, Boyle Heights, has been affected by gentrification in ways that is displacing the Latin people who've lived there. So the Latine people are often responding. This series does it in a comedic and dramatic way. On Latinx culture, we also have Latin History for Morons by John Leguizamo. Cesar's Last Fast, which, as Romero does and as Cesar Chavez does, both show how the Eucharist is an expression of nonviolence and can be used to accompany nonviolent movements and enrich them. And of course, the great Dolores Huerta, who inspires and is still hard at work today, is inspiring us, and whose life asks us to look at a lot of issues that we may have put away. I'm now going to just kind of flip through these. I know through time's sake, just these illustrate various nonviolent movements of Northern Ireland. It's amazing how many students today don't know that, can't imagine that the UK was at war with the people of Northern Ireland and the Irish. So these movies give us an idea of nonviolent movements around the world, monks who carried cameras at great personal risk to record what was happening in Myanmar, nonviolence in Palestine, in Israel. Between them are maybe the term corporate oligarchy, and there's a sequel coming out to The Corporation, these films, which speak to the widening gap of income inequality and what that's doing to us. The idea that a recession was not just a natural phenomena, but was man-made and cost lives, really. A drama version of that. And then our coal in our country is often so politicized, and this gives us a little history of that, along with the labor strikes about that. We can tie Rerum Novarum to this and care of the environment. This is a film that illustrates solidarity when gay people in the 80s joined together with um, coal miners who were striking and didn't necessarily see themselves as having anything in common together until they fought together, reminding that the work of nonviolence exists in our personal relationships in our school communities as well. That our sports world is also informed by stories of migration and stories of feeling like the other. That are the Kotze films, or Keonuskatze, landmark films that are almost like meditative experiences on our lives being out of balance. And um, movies about the Holocaust, such as this one, in which the main character says, "There's no pit so deep that God is not deeper still." And then this one, which tells us that homosexuals who were rounded up in by the Nazis and experimented upon and imprisoned did not get liberated when everybody else did, and stayed in jails for years afterwards. Imprisonment, death row, and what happens when somebody asks for forgiveness but still is headed towards execution. The use of creativity in relieving poverty, such as in these brothels in India, and giving the kids who live there cameras to expand their world. The We get inspired at the work of making peace when we see how families endure such challenges in being at war, as in For Sama. And then the sequence in the Mother Teresa documentary where they, at great risk, go into Lebanon, go into Beirut during bombing, trying to get a ceasefire so they can go in and rescue children who are disabled. And the extraordinary sequence where we see how love literally heals. And my favorite film of in this vein, probably, of Gods and Men, because it incorporates all these elements. The the community, Christian community of brothers and monks who must decide if they're going to continue their nonviolent ministry when terrorists approach, or will they flee. Conscience, social justice, the after effects of colonization, and ultimately our own connection with each other. That we only sometimes find in the depths and mysteries of our faith. And so here's how you can contact me. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time. I'm sorry if I went over, but I hope I gave you some resources that you and yours can use. And I hope you have a great Ignatian family gathering. Um, Much love and blessings to you, and peace.